was one of those wild boys, partying, playing, having fun. I wasn't mad at God, I just didn't know anything. I got introduced to all kinds of wildness, craziness. I was upset, I was angry, I was depressed, I was mad at the world. My heart was devastated. I'm Jimmy, and this is my story. I was raised in a really good home. I had great parents. In fact, my dad was a firefighter, so I was raised in the home of a first responder. And that also took me down some dark roads. See, my parents were not followers of Jesus. They were not Christians. And so I was raised my whole life never going to church. I wasn't pro-God, I wasn't anti-God, there was no God in my life. Growing up in the home of a father who never prayed before a meal, we never went to church, never even thought about going to church growing up. God began to reach out to me through my grandmother. She was what you would call today a praying grandmother. And so I credit a lot of those early yearnings for God to my grandmother. On occasion growing up, we would go to like a vacation Bible school during the summer. And of course, it was my grandmother taking us. And we would get back and it was fun and I would learn a lot of activities. And you know, there were some seeds that were sowed into my life early on. But other than that, there was no other point of reference for God other than my grandmother. Life goes on and life happens. I remember getting invited to a slumber party with a bunch of dudes. I was like, this is great, a bunch of guys having a slumber party, that'll be fun. And so we went, but we had no idea that the mom had another plan. She was gonna kidnap us, basically. She put us all in a van, there was 5 or 6 of us, and drove us to church. And we sit through the whole sermon on the back row and wondering, why are we at church? Turns out it was an old-fashioned revival preacher, and he was on fire. And something inside of me starts to resonate with what he's saying. And the more the sermon went on, of course, the louder he got, because it was an old-fashioned revival, the more I was listening and the more it was resonating, and my heart started to beat, and my palms started to sweat, and I started to think, this sounds like it's true. Whatever he was talking about, I wanted it. So at the end of that sermon, he gave an altar call. He said, if you believe what I'm saying, and this is speaking to your heart, I want you to come to the front. And I, without hesitation, I got up out of my seat and I walked down the whole length of the aisle and met him at the front. I had no idea what I was doing down there. I just knew he said, if you believe this, come forward. So I did what he said. I feel like for me, I was introduced into Jesus, just like you would meet a stranger on the street and you introduce yourself and you shake hands and then you go about your way. And so I went about my way for the next few years. Again, not going to church, not doing anything with it really. You know, maybe I'll see you again, and then life went on. I go through my junior high and high school years, and I'm a pretty typical, just so you know, from West Texas, the Panhandle kind of kid, where I got introduced to all kinds of wildness, craziness, drinking a lot of beer, partying, playing. I loved music. I took guitar lessons when I was very young, and I fell in love with rock and roll from that era of time. So I had all of Led Zeppelin up to that point. I was listening to Bad Company, Kiss, Heart, you name it. And I was riffing on all that. I had a guitar and I was learning all those riffs. And so music began to take on a real important part of my life. And I found myself, okay, now I know what I want to be when I grow up. I'm going to be a rock star. So then I roll into my senior year of high school, and I've got questions starting to percolate in my life again. There was this organization called Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And if you were in sports, you had to attend these meetings. And they would bring in football players like Ed Moody of the Detroit Lions and others from Texas Tech. And they would come in and they'd tell their testimonies. And I remember thinking, man, these guys are cool. These guys are athletes, but they have this thing with God. They love God. And I would hear their testimonies, and every time I heard a testimony about Jesus, it would go off in my chest like a tuning fork. And it would resonate, just like music resonated with me. This truth would resonate with me. And then we'd all go out and get in my pickup and go drink beer and drive around and listen to Kiss. It was such a wild juxtaposition of living our lives our way, but also being hungry for something more. And that was genuine and real. And I know for me, I was searching for God. I just didn't know it, didn't know what I was searching for. One of my best friends, Lenny, he had an encounter with Jesus and it changed his life. And I saw that he was changed. I saw that he was different. And then one night, Lenny calls me, he says, hey, me and Steve are gonna come out to the house. We'll be there in 10 minutes. And he and Steve, the youth minister, came out to my house. And he shares again the gospel. This is now like the third or fourth time I've heard this story about what Jesus did for me. He's saying, Jesus did this for you, Jimmy. He gave his life for you. He died on a cross for you. He shed his blood for you. For whatever reason that night, it had to be God, had to be the Spirit of God. It clicked for me. He says, do you want to receive Jesus Christ? Do you want to accept him into your heart and give him your life? And I said, yes, I do. And I heard myself say it, almost like out of body. Yes, I do. And he prayed, and then I followed him in a prayer. And it was like all this weight went off of me. And what I've realized after he told me, I described what happened, he said, Jimmy, that was the sin. All this sin, the weight of sin that you've been carrying for all these years. He said, that's coming off of your life. And once I did, I never looked back after that. God began to work in my life in a big way. I met a girl at church, and I was a brand new Christian, dating a Christian girl, and we got married. 2 weeks after we're married, I turned over to her right before we go to sleep, and I said, hey, I think God's calling me to the ministry. I thought she would be so excited. Do you know what she said? I promised I would never marry a preacher. And she said, I won't ever hear about this again. My heart was devastated. And then over the years, I was growing exponentially in my walk with God. And unfortunately, my wife wasn't. And I was growing and learning about new things. I was so hungry for the Bible, so hungry for the Word of God. But what I didn't realize is we were growing apart. But it was so subtle, I didn't even see it. Here we are now, 10 years later, married for 10 years. My wife looks at me and coldly says, I want out. And we were getting ready to go see friends, and I said, out of what? She said, out of this marriage. And just 60 days later, I had divorce papers. Here I am now, a pastor, a minister, a man of God. Now I've got the scarlet letter, the D on my forehead. And I was in a conservative denomination, evangelical denomination that didn't take kindly to people getting a divorce, especially pastors. And 1 week later, I resigned the church I'd been serving for 4 years because I felt like I needed to heal and I needed to get some downtime. I was upset, I was angry, I was depressed, I was mad at God, I was mad at the world. So I moved back to my hometown, back to the Panhandle, back where it all started. For therapeutic reasons, I start working out and going to the gym. And I get involved with a bunch of bodybuilders. For 3 weeks, I partied with these guys. And I would end up talking to people about Jesus, and they'd end up confessing things to me. I'd end up counseling people. I realized that being a pastor and a minister wasn't a job for me. It wasn't a vocation. It was who God called me to be. And I took those guys to church with me. We walked into this big Sunday school class. And I walked through the door, and when I walked into that class and walked into that room, I had this sense, I'm home. So I'm looking around, and my eyes land on this one person. This one girl caught my eye. She was beautiful. Never thought about it again until a few nights later when I was at the gym again. And that same girl walked into the gym. I'd never seen her in that gym before. I was a regular there. I was honest. I said, hey, I saw you at church on Sunday. She had not seen me. I said, I saw you. I said, so you go to church there? And she said, yeah. And I said, that's great. And from that moment forward, we were never apart. Now going on 31 years. We got married. We got back into ministry. We began to grow together as a family. And now all of my kids are involved in ministry. In fact, we were blessed to adopt another child on the heels of all of this and raise another. So we had 3 children. All 3 are involved in ministry. They're either leading ministry, they're serving on a staff, or they're serving a church today. And it is the beauty of redemption that God can bring beauty out of ashes. He can bring greatness out of brokenness. God has a way of turning what the enemy means to destroy and turning it for your blessing and for your goodness. That's the God I serve. And yet, what the Lord all along was trying to teach me was that He identifies me. He defines my life. So, I had it tattooed on my arm. It's John 8:36, and it says this, "Who the Son sets free is free indeed." And so I had it tattooed on my arm, not just so other people can see it, but so I can see it, so I can be reminded every day that I am free in Christ.